lot of the policies came from the public health establishment. Is your contention that Big Pharma was deeply involved in this decision making at the beginning, or do you have evidence around that?
Yeah, so when you watch these FDA and CDC meetings where these expert advisors are weighing in on the data, what one would want is a rigorous back and forth, right? You'd want skepticism. What do they call it in the military? A red team to challenge the plan by the blue team, right? You would want pushback from the experts to question all aspects of the data, to be skeptical, to be curious, to make sure that the data is robust. That was my expectation going in to watching these meetings. That's not what happens at all. These insiders, these so-called experts, see themselves as allies with industry. There's no hard questions. In fact, at a recent meeting, these so-called expert advisors apologized to Moderna for asking a single hard question about the data. They often use the word "we" to refer to FDA and the pharmaceutical company that's applying for licensing of these vaccines. They see themselves as in the same business together. And it's really just about getting the approval process across the line, getting these things authorized, and getting these shots into arms as quickly as possible into as many people as possible. And then hopefully maybe sort of kind of gathering data about possible harms later, and then that sort of falls apart. The FDA had this system called V-Safe during the initial rollout of COVID shots. Well, they've dismantled V-Safe now. It was the only active surveillance system they had of vaccine harms. They've given up on that. There's this long-standing system called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. It's passive, it's not ideal. They always pour cold water on that and say that it's not reliable. We don't have a vaccine safety system in this country. We just don't. And so we would want these doctors and scientists to be acting in the public interest. They're not. They're actually acting in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry. And then they tend to be rewarded for that, either with NIH grants or with a revolving door where they actually get jobs as vice presidents or what have you of these various vaccine manufacturers. It's a completely corrupt system.
I have to believe that most doctors, for example, research people go in to their fields to do good. Maybe they want to do well for themselves, but they're not looking to be in the sort of structure that you're describing to me. How could it be possible that so many distinguished, ostensibly decent people are completely oblivious to this, and in fact would say, well, this is preposterous, this is conspiracy theory, right? Which is, you hear that a lot. Anyway, but that's the difficulty you're always facing it in any area which seems to sort of defy, let's call it the correct view, the orthodox view, right, today.
Yeah, that's very well said. And many people in the movement for medical freedom tell a story of monsters, right? Of evildoers, of nefarious actors behind the curtain who want to do harm, who enjoy harm. We've seen that.
I just want to jump in and say, we know those exist too.
Fair enough.
Right? So there are some, but that's not going to be everybody, right?
Exactly.
Or some large portion of people.
Right. I think this is more a story of structural incentives that are misaligned. So if you're a pediatrician, look, I'm sure most pediatricians went into that line of work with the best of intentions to help children thrive and live the healthiest life. But you come out of medical school with $250,000 or more in debt, You go through the hazing process of residency, staying up all night and being yelled at by the chief resident and what have you, right? And you finally make it into your private practice, or maybe you're working at a hospital, and you're told that you get a bonus if 60% of your patients are fully vaccinated. So you're like, okay, I'll get the bonus this year. It'll help me pay off my debts. And the next year it's 70% of your patients have to be fully vaccinated. And then 80% of your patients have to be fully vaccinated. And by that point, well, you've gone along with the system for a while and it seems to be okay. And it's a series of baby steps over a long period of time. And so this thing that I do where I actually watch the FDA and CDC meetings to see what they're up to, well, they don't have time to do that, right? So they just take somebody else's word for it. And they say, well, if it's okay with the CDC and the FDA, it's probably okay. It's a series of structural incentives that are not aligned with the public interest and a slippery slope and trying to fit in. And look, these people are selected for their ability to fit in, for the ability to obey orders. Medicine is very hierarchical. It's organized along military lines. You see these FDA and CDC officials who, some of them have military rank. This is not a normal workplace that we're talking about. Over time, I think you just slide down the slippery slope of not asking questions, and then it becomes too late, right? You've been doing this for 10 years. You've kind of looked the other way when things have gone sideways with a couple of your patients, and now you're culpable. And so I think there's a mental process that we don't understand very well, by which people eventually buy in, but they become true believers. They're not, I don't even think they realize that they're causing harm or that they're recommending shots that are not tested against proper placebos, that have not been shown to produce the benefits that are claimed, right? So I think it's a process over the course of years. I think it's subtle. I think it's a story of very good people who end up doing bad things in some case. And look, Hannah Arendt dealt with this in trying to understand what happened with Nazi Germany. And that was a story of monsters, right? And lots of Nazi monsters. The SS was horrible. Lots of society was horrible. But she told a story of bureaucrats, right? The banality of evil and the ways that bureaucracies create various incentives that lead to outcomes that nobody would have wanted in the beginning. So, I mean, it's a sociological story of how societies go off track, and I think the United States society has gone off track.
You described a situation where, you know, that accountability which we want to believe is there is not really there. So what do you think is there?
Instead of accountability?
Yes.
Profit motive, fitting in, not rocking the boat, belonging, identity, belief in. I mean, we live in a society where faith in God, religious practice has declined. But in its place, we sort of worship this pharma junk science. It's become an idol. It's become a belief system. It's become divorced from science itself, the rigorous rough and tumble of science itself. That's not the proper way to do medicine. We must have skepticism. We must be curious. We must demand the most rigorous standards. And that's not happening right now, given the power of the pharmaceutical industry to shape the conversation and the ways that the media reports on it, the ways that politicians and regulators think about these issues.
So that seems terribly daunting to think, to conceive of and imagine, you know, but certainly at least the vestiges of, this incredible system that the founding fathers of America conceived exists. And, there's a legal system which seems to be functioning, at least in some ways, very well, pushing back on some very significant directions. We're in this moment. Society has changed. There's a growing kind of pushback to some of that change. People are becoming more cognizant that something bizarre has happened, and they need to, wake up. What do you think people should be doing here?
We had this economic and political system that over time has become corrupted. We have corporations getting larger and larger and larger, and then eventually colluding and taking over the state and weaponizing the state to increase their profits in ways that make us poorer and also hurt people when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry pushing products that are not safe on the general population. So let's take this in two different pieces. So the first piece is what to do about big pharma. That's the 800-pound gorilla. So let's start there. During my doctoral thesis, I did the regulatory history of successful regulation of other toxic products. So asbestos, tobacco, DDT, various pharmaceutical products, thalidomide that caused harm. Even going back a long ways to the beginning of the regulatory state that emerges with the progressive era. Government doesn't really want to fund the studies that are going to smash an industry and lead to a product being withdrawn from the market. The way that you get good science in connection with dangerous products is through the courts. It's through the toxic tort system. And so basically, plaintiffs' lawyers will take a look at whatever data they can find about a toxic product. They will calculate the odds of winning a court case, a toxic tort case, and then they will actually go out and fund the scientific research to figure out how dangerous this product actually is. That's how the system has worked over the last.
So that's how
years.
this research that you end up spending those weeks reading gets done. That's what you're telling me, because industry isn't doing it, right? That's
correct.
Fascinating.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So you actually need the court system, and you need deep pocket plaintiffs' attorneys to spend $10 million, $20 million, what have you, on a study, so that you actually have the data to figure out how harmful a toxic product is. That's the way our system works. The pharmaceutical industry knew that. They were losing in court in the 70s and early 1980s when it came to lawsuits over harms from vaccines. So in 1986, they got Congress to pass the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and that gave them liability protection. You cannot take the pharmaceutical industry to court if your child is harmed by a vaccine because of the 1986 Act. There's this separate court system. It doesn't work very well. The government stands in on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry rather than the pharmaceutical industry representing itself. So the way to solve the problem of toxic vaccines being forced upon the population is to remove liability protection for the pharmaceutical industry. Put it back into the courts. Let's fight it out in the courts. Let's have a conversation about the data in the courts in an adversarial system, not in the CDC and the FDA that are captured. But you'd have to repeal the 1986 Act. You'd also have to repeal the PrEP Act that happens in the early 2000s after the events of 9/11 and what have you. If we do that, the pharmaceutical industry would have an incentive to create safer vaccines. Right now, the only incentive is to add as many vaccines as possible to the schedule because it's just all profit and there's no risk because they can't be taken to court right now. So that's how we deal with the pharmaceutical industry. But the pharmaceutical industry is one big cartel, but there's 9 or 10 other cartels that are problematic. So I think we need to do a couple things. We need to bring back antitrust. We need to break up some of these oligopolies and actually force these companies to compete with each other so that the market decides. I also think the administrative state has grown too big. So we no longer have elected officials, legislators making decisions. The administrative state, the bureaucratic state, is making over half of the new policies that govern our day-to-day lives. And it's completely out of control. The administrative state needs to be completely reined in. The size of the state needs to be shrunk significantly, and power needs to be decentralized. We need to take matters of health out of DC and not just move them to the states, but move them to families, right? And empower families and local jurisdictions to make decisions. This notion that we're just going to turn to 15 bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to make all our decisions for our lives, it's failed. This was an experiment over the last 3.5 years about how we might respond to a pandemic, to a crisis, what have you. Centralizing power in Washington, D.C., centralizing public health decisions in Washington, D.C. has been a catastrophic failure. We must empower families, parents, individuals to make their own decisions. We have to shrink the size of the federal government so that they can't be captured, so they can't try to take over all aspects of our lives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, except you're describing a situation where, to some extent, the institutions that would do that are going to have a hard time doing that because of the capture that you describe.
I'm saying we need a political revolution in this country to seize power back from corrupted industries, from a corrupted government. Half measures aren't going to do it. Gradualism is not going to do it. So in my PhD work, I found that the costs of autism are so enormous. You could do the same thing with diabetes, you could do the same thing with cancer, what have you. The cost of the mismanagement of the COVID crisis has generated trillions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry and left us sick, poor, rampant inflation, massive budget deficits. The federal government is completely out of control. Our political system is completely out of control. There are various politicians who are running for president who are promising small tweaks around the edges. That's not going to do it. We need a wholesale reconceptualization of our government. We need to return to a smaller government. We need to take matters of public health out of the hands of corrupted bureaucrats. But that's only going to happen if there's a political revolution from below. So I think people of good faith of both parties need to demand that their candidates address these issues. So, I mean, it's a political organizing problem. It's a massive problem, but we're getting sicker by the day. We are not well cared for by government officials. We are in a moment of crisis. We've been in a moment of crisis for at least 3.5 years, but probably for at least 35 years since the 1986 Act passed. We need a revolution from below to restore sanity to our broken system.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation for me. A final thought as we finish?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. So this seems like a very complicated story, and I think it's actually relatively straightforward. If you follow the money, you can actually figure out what's going on. This is a relatively straightforward story of the way that a society loses its way, the ways that power corrupts, the ways that corruption takes over a corporation, an industry, government. If you follow the money, there's a money trail here that's pretty obvious. who's getting rich off of this, who has no liability for harms, and all of the injuries and suffering are happening with families and individuals. I think at the end of the day, this is a question of who do you want making decisions. I think when we centralize power in Washington, D.C., as we've seen over the last 3.5 years, bad things happen, society falls apart, capture leads to dangerous products being forced upon the general public. I think we just need to get back to our roots, to our values, to 330 million people making the best decisions for their lives, not captured bureaucrats telling us how to live.
Well, Toby Rogers, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed our conversation so much.
Thank you all for joining Toby Rogers and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.
$250 years of economic